we know right now, especially with the pandemic, with COVID-19, that housing is one of, if not the biggest stress point that and crisis point that working families are now encountering as a result of this shock to our economy. 20 million more people have gone and are now enduring unemployment in the time since COVID-19 hit. That's 20 million on top of the millions of people that have already been enduring or recovering from unemployment prior to the pandemic. And what that means is that there are now millions of people who don't know how they're going to continue paying their rent. They don't know how they're going to continue making their mortgage payments, and they don't know how they're going to continue making sure that they can afford to live. And right now, in a time when so many people are threatened, whose lives are threatened by a pandemic, their lives shouldn't also be threatened by the fear of eviction, by the fear of foreclosure, or worse, and just general displacement. But I also think it's important for us to talk about the fact that housing has been a public health issue since before this pandemic as well. When we talk to our nurses, when we talk to our wonderful, amazing nurses here in the Bronx and in Queens, many of them organizing with the Nurses Union, our nurses have also been fighting for housing policy as well. And why is that? Because housing is one of the number one social indicators of your health. If you go through displacement, if you are evicted, if you are foreclosed on, and you don't know where to go, it can have an enormous health toll on yourself. It creates kind of a perfect storm of conditions of insecurity that contribute to a lot of health issues. And so housing was an enormous social indicator of health status since before this pandemic. And now that, again, just like many other issues, is being exacerbated and exaggerated and really increased in the face of COVID-19. And so what do we need to do to make sure that we actually help real people? And that goes for renters, but it also goes for mom and pop landlords. One of the first things that we talk about, which is our first demand, is rent cancellation. And oftentimes the first reaction is, what about the landlords? What about people with mortgages? What about, mom and pops? And I think it's important to recognize the fact that there are some folks that have, that are mom and pop landlords that own maybe one home and that they rent out to tenants. But the thing is that there's a huge difference between that and a commercial landlord that owns a huge luxury condominium with tons of people, or even just any that owns a huge building with tons of units that's hiking up rent on all of their tenants. So first of all, that's an important distinction. The second thing that we're fighting for, though, is mortgage suspension as well. On the federal level, we need to make sure that mortgages and rent are completely taken care of so that there is no excuse for a person being removed from their home. There is no reason, and we need to remove all reason, rationale for evicting a person, especially during a time of a pandemic. So we need to make sure that we're taking very clear federal action to suspend both mortgage and rent payments in this time. And it's actually, when you think about how this is structured, it's not hard. One thing that you can do is just suspend mortgage payments. Like, here's the path to canceling rent. We're going to lay it out right here. And here's just one path of canceling rent. There's a couple of ways that we can go about this, but here's one very clear way. One way that we can cancel rent is to suspend mortgage payments for the cancellation period. Let's say we want to start with 3 months. Suspend mortgage payments for 3 months. Tack that on to the end of the repayment period. So let's say you have a 10-year mortgage, just suspend it for 3 months and make it a 10-year and 3-month mortgage so that you just make 3 additional payments at the very end. Now, what that allows you to do is it opens up the time, and you can take that suspension time to cancel rent, to make sure that we cancel the rent of any tenants in that building. They don't have to pay it back, and it does not create an additional financial liability on that landlord. So that's a very broad stroke way. Of course, there are other issues that we'll have to address, like property taxes and other issues. But if you have been collecting rent up until this time, then it also means that we can figure this out. We can figure it out. But right now, the question is not, can we get it done? And sorry if you hear the sirens in the background, everybody. I'm in the Bronx, and unfortunately, we're hearing these all day. But what we can do is that, and rather what our issue is right now is not that it's impossible to do, and it's not that we can't do it. It's that we lack enough politicians with the political will to actually help people who are tenants and to actually help people who are mom and pop landlords. We're seeing that with PPP. We're seeing that with all of these relief programs. You know, there's been relief package after relief package. We've passed almost about 4 different pieces of legislation related to coronavirus relief. And you wouldn't know that, would you? Because those 4 pieces of legislation are not being felt by everyday people as much as they need to be. So what we need to do is that with this legislation, it's being overwhelmingly slanted to the wealthy. It's being overwhelmingly slanted to the people who need help the least. And we need to turn that around to make sure that we are actually focused in not compromising on making sure that we are delivering results on the people who I think it's just really important to communicate that these things don't happen magically. They happen when we organize, and they happen when we fight for them. And that doesn't even fight along partisan lines. We have to, as we know here in New York, we have to fight with Democrats in order to make sure that these things get accomplished. And I think sometimes that's the big, nationally it's seen as a scandal to call out Democrats, but we're here in the state of New York. We have a Democratic governor. We have a Democratic state legislature. We have a Democratic city council, and we are still struggling to cancel rent. It's unacceptable. And so for that, we need to make sure that we are putting the heat on, because money in politics is not unique to the Republican Party. Money in politics also has a corrosive and corrupting influence in Democratic Party politics as well. That's why we got to call it out. That's why we have to push for rent and mortgage moratoriums, because as we all know, it's like this parable where people act, and a lot of these conservatives, they act as though money trickles down. And we know that that's a myth, but let's get one thing really straight. Money doesn't trickle down, but despair does. Because over and over again, the richest and the wealthiest people are shielded when a huge crisis hits our country. And then it's the people below them that feel it more, and the people below them that feel it more as well. And there's no other place where we can see that the most right here in housing, because here we have the bankers, and we have the hedge funds, and we have these huge real estate developers, right? They benefited from this $4 trillion relief package. They were able to get their little tax loopholes written in this most recent care package, so that real estate developers can rake in millions of dollars from a coronavirus relief package. So they actually ended up with that package up. They ended up on it. They have benefited from this crisis. But then you take it down one step, right? Then you look at these mom and pop landlords. Now, a lot of them have tenants that are unable to pay rent, but they don't get to benefit from these huge kind of big bank bailouts, right? And so now they are feeling a squeeze in this moment. But as we know, owning real estate, owning property is also an aspect of wealth. So while they are in a tight point right now, they are still not experiencing the deepest of the deepest terrors of this crisis, which are tenants and single family homeowners, where the only thing that you are paying a mortgage on is the house that you live in. So it's the people who are paying rent and the people who are paying mortgages and people who do not have a second property, that are terrified of being evicted, that are terrified of being foreclosed on and kicked out in the streets. And so as we see, once again, this pandemic hits, and the banks and the hedge funds are protected, and they even get little sweetener deals. And then everyday working people and people trying to just make things, make it by, are the ones that are feeling the brunt of this crisis. So it's no surprise that we're seeing things pan out this way, but we also have to make sure that we are calling out elected officials that are not doing anything about it. Because here's the deal. This is a choice. Mass unemployment in the United States was a choice. We had policy options in front of us, and we could have guaranteed payrolls in the United States of America to prevent any person from losing their job due to coronavirus. And what did elected officials do? What did Mitch McConnell do? What did Donald Trump do? They chose not to do that. So these are not things that happen by accident. Unemployment is not happening by accident. If we face this precipice of mass evictions and foreclosures, that is not an accident. It is a plan. And we have to interrupt that plan. We have to interject in that plan. And that comes with ratcheting up political pressure. It comes with organizing. And the thing is, when it comes to these rent strikes, to echo what each and every one of you have said, is that people aren't striking because they don't feel like paying rent. People are striking because they can't pay rent. They can't. It doesn't matter how many threatening text messages a landlord or a building sends to their tenants. It doesn't matter how much you threaten legal action. It doesn't matter how much you intimidate anybody. People can't pay. You cannot coerce someone into doing something that they cannot do. There is no money in the bank. People need to feed their kids. We cannot be evicting. We need to be making sure that we are passing policy that allows people to stay in their homes. That is what we have to do. Now, there were a couple of requests made of me from our advocates, and I want you to let you all know that I will happily and gladly comply with those requests. As what Maria had asked of Woodside on the Move, for us to pressure and ask Governor Cuomo for a rent cancellation. I can let you all know, privately, I have had personal conversations with the governor asking him to do this. I have had them by phone. We've had them with our policy teams. And so if the next step is to now escalate and make these requests publicly, I am fine doing that because I've picked up the phone. We've had these meetings, and we need to make sure that rent cancellation happens on the state and federal level. Now, that's in terms of state action. In terms of federal action, I think one of the things that was also requested is that we co-sponsor Representative Ilhan Omar's bill. I believe we're already co-sponsored, but if we aren't, I'll double, triple check. But I can give you my assurances that we will be co-sponsored if I'm not already on the bill. So those are things that I'm happy to comply with. And when it comes to housing folks in hotels, I think this is something that is absolutely necessary. It was already just an enormous moral wrong that leading up to this crisis, we had more vacant apartments in New York City than we had people who did not have homes. So that we had more empty homes than we had homeless. And that applies to large portions of this country. And what that tells us, when there are more homes that are empty than there are people without homes, what that tells us is that our whole damn system is broken. The whole system is broken. It means that we are prioritizing greed and profit and asset prices over human life and the right to live under a roof. Because we would not have an unprecedented housing crisis in New York City if it were not for the real estate lobby here in the city and in the state and in the country. We would not have a homelessness crisis at the level that we have had, unprecedented. Like, let's get one thing really straight. New York City, before coronavirus, was experiencing some of the highest rates of homelessness since the Great Depression. That is directly linked to the fact that we have speculated and boosted and boomed rent prices to some of the highest rates we have ever seen in history. Those two things are not just coincidences. When rent goes up, people get displaced. And every time we think that there's just no level and no limit to the amount of greed, when we think that for example, you look at some of these landlords and you look at some of these developers, when you purchase a building, that cost for you to purchase that building remains fixed. You have maintenance cost, but the actual, this is why people buy homes, right? Because it will give them a reliable payment, because your mortgages do not go up. If you get a fixed rate, they do not go up month after month, but rent, or year after year, rent is going up year after year. And so it makes no sense that we are squeezing people that already cannot afford to purchase their own home for more money than a person who already owns land and is a landowning member or a home owning member of our economy. It's wrong. And what this is doing is that it's just squeezing blood out of a rock. And there's no more left. There's no more left. And so for that, we have to call for federal rent and mortgage moratoriums. We have to call for a rent freeze. I cannot think of a single reason why rent should go up this next year. I can't think of almost a single reason, unless the reason you're providing is just profiteering. And right now in a pandemic, we should not be profiteering. We're talking about a second wave hitting in the fall. We're talking about the fact that we do not have a vaccine. We think there's going to be a vaccine in 18 months. We don't know. We don't know if it's going to be mass tested, mass available, how effective it will be. And as long as that's the case, we should not be raising rents on people right now, not with unprecedented unemployment, not with anything else. And the fact of the matter is, and this is where I think we have hope, is that the situation is that we are on the side of reality. We are on the side of real life. And so the question is not, will landlords be defaulting on their mortgages if we don't do anything? The question is when they default on their mortgages if we don't do anything. So we need to do something. We have to do something. Because again, just like we said, these are choices. If we do not protect tenants, if we do not protect people, everyday people, then we are barreling towards another economic crisis on top of another economic crisis. We have a choice, and leadership means making tough choices, because the easy choices are made by everybody else. And so our job is to do the hard thing. Our job is to do the unpopular thing. And I just want you all to know that when I go down and when I vote against these relief packages, it gives me no pleasure. I want to make sure that we are doing things that need to be done, but we also need to hold the line. And if we are not giving relief to tenants, and if we are not giving relief to everyday people, then we should not be supporting packages that help bankers and the wealthy and the rich and do little to nothing to everyday people and mom and pops.